Today I'm going to talk about spiritual bypassing, or at least my own interpretation of what that means in relation to the pagan community, and also talk a bit about how paganism relates to political activism and whether or not it's important for paganism to relate to political activism, whether or not we can say that paganism has failed if it has failed to instigate real political or social change. I was inspired to make this video by a blog post that John Halstead wrote back in, or sometime early this year, but it was a continuation of a conversation, or maybe I should say a diatribe, that he has been having since about 2017, 2018. John Halstead was a favourite blogger of mine when I was getting started on the pantheistic paganism journey back in 2011, 2012. He was a huge influence on me and my thinking. He introduced me to Jung, he introduced me to a lot of different ideas that became central to my evolving spiritual practice. But around that time, 2017, 2018, he started to get extraordinarily frustrated with the pagan community. So he had always had this very skeptical slant that I very much appreciated. But what he started to get particularly frustrated with around this time was what he perceived as a lack of true and extensive engagement with environmentalism, and the inability in his mind for contemporary paganism to make good on its promises to transform the world, to move us towards a greener world, to help save the environmental crisis. I'm not here to necessarily totally disagree with him. To be completely honest, my reaction to reading his latest blog post was pretty violent. I originally thought that I was going to go on a bit of a rant in this video. I really felt quite one-sided on the issue. I disagreed with him wholeheartedly. I have started to develop quite a knee-jerk reaction to people in the community, and especially to academics, who tend to view paganism with a very critical eye because they understand it as promising to do something that it then doesn't. And that promise is essentially to affect social and environmental change. And sometimes it's not even that people are pointing towards actual promises made by people in this community, or that it's not that they're actually picking out specific language or specific suggestions by the community that this is what paganism is supposed to be about. What frustrates me the most is when I see authors assuming that because paganism is alternative, because it positions itself as alternative to the mainstream, as an alternative to Christianity, that therefore that inherently means that it has to be wrapped up in a political movement, for change, and I don't know, as an alternative to just mainstream, middle of the road, you know, we're just going along with what's happening environmentally and so on. And I just feel that this is a bit of a misunderstanding from my perspective of what religion and spirituality should be. I think that making these assumptions, sometimes people are a little bit uncritical about the assumptions that they're making about spiritual movements and what they can and cannot and should not achieve. So John Halstead's argument is that paganism has failed because it has failed to bring about this worldwide powerful movement towards social and environmental change, basically to fix the environmental crisis, or at least to have provided a massive groundswell and to be moving us towards the necessary changes that have to happen, and that honestly needed to have happened already in order to halt or slow down global warming. We're already past that point of no return, which is probably why around 2017, 2018 was when people started to become more concerned about this, because that was the point at which we really had reached a tipping point in terms of how much had and hadn't been done about the problem. So as I said, my knee-jerk reaction to this post was to disagree, especially because the rhetoric in it really reminded me of some academic works that were done. Especially there was one in particular, it's fairly well known. It's not particularly well loved or anything like that, or well respected even, but there is this quite well known book in the New Age, the scholarly New Age circles, called Selling Spirituality by Carrette and King. I can't remember their first names off the top of my head. And I mean, the title, Selling Spirituality, it tells you a lot about what you need to know. The whole idea was that alternative spirituality is not really bringing about any real societal, political change. In fact, it is furthering the contemporary neoliberal society or world that we are living in. It's buying into corporatism, and it's just perpetuating our current economic, political climate. And my biggest problem, I had a lot of problems with their work, but my biggest problem with it was this underlying assumption that spirituality, alternative spirituality, should be effecting social change. Now, of course, my full response is a lot more nuanced than just disagreeing outright with these statements, because of course I believe that societal change is very important. Of course I am very dissatisfied with the way that the world is currently operating. I see huge problems in the world that I think are very important, that all of us should be taking steps to rectify. And I'm not for a minute saying that anyone should just sit back on their laurels and not do anything because it's not important spiritually or religiously to do so. In fact, I'm basically making the complete opposite point. I have actually come to believe over the years that conflating spirituality and religion and spiritual and religious movements with political movements and the need for political change actually may cause more harm than good, and is probably overall potentially going to be much less powerful than if we actually just separated the two, accepted that they are two different realms, they're two different spheres, and that we should actually just spend our lives looking at them separately as much as possible, or to some extent, and pursuing different goals in those two different areas of our lives. I'm not saying that the two should never overlap, and obviously they will. Obviously sometimes it's very important that they do, and sometimes we have very important insights to bring from one side to another and vice versa. But I'm starting to think that the problem is not so much that paganism has failed to affect social political change. It's more that certain people have perhaps over the last few decades sat back and assumed that just because they were pagans, they were in an alternative spirituality that was suggesting that environmentalism is important and that the green earth is important and greening the world is important, that meant that they were already doing enough and that nothing else needed to be done. And then that actually led to an awful lot of people who otherwise might have been very politically engaged with this particular issue actually didn't take any political action at all, because they were focused solely on their spirituality, their spiritual engagement, as a means to redress this problem. So actually I think ultimately myself and John are coming to a very similar conclusion, but we're maybe pointing our fingers in different directions, or at least in a different way. I think we're looking at the same problem, but from two slightly different angles. John is looking at it with this frustration that paganism was not what he had hoped it would be. I think that John probably used to be a person who, I'm making assumptions here because I can't remember enough of his blog posts from that far back to know this, but John is the type of person that I can imagine, or I can imagine other people having had spiritual experiences like him and spiritual backgrounds like him, who might have thought to himself, great, this is a spiritual religious movement that I can get involved in that relates to earth-based practices, that relates to the environment, it relates to all of this all of these progressive ideals, and it is working, it claims to be at least in harmony with environmentalist movements, therefore my job is done, without necessarily thinking it through the whole way. Like, I don't think anyone's actually sitting back and thinking, yes, therefore I have done everything that I need to do for the environment. But I think that there was a tendency clearly in John to assume that this movement that he was getting into and that he was engaged with would actually result in the changes that he thought needed to happen. And then his reaction was therefore many years down the line to look back and say, or maybe not that many years down the line, but at some point down the line to look back and say, hang on a minute, all of that stuff that I thought that paganism could achieve, it has not done it. It's been hollow, it's been empty, it hasn't been doing what it claimed to do. My question is, did paganism ever actually really claim to solve the environmental crisis? I'm not going to sit here and say that nobody has ever claimed this, that no pagan or no pagan movement has ever claimed to be able to solve this problem, or that they were moving towards solving this problem, or that they were environmentalists. And certainly an awful lot of pagan texts do make reference to environmentalism, the environmental crisis, and so on. And some of them do overtly suggest that by doing this work, for example, by working with the Dark Goddess, that through doing this work on ourselves, that we are inherently going to be helping with the problem, that we are helping the world move towards a future in which everyone is working in tandem and in harmony and understands the cycles of the earth, and will therefore naturally bring about a resolution to this crisis. But it's pretty subtle. There's never really, or not that I've seen, there don't tend to be really overt statements saying this is our goal, this is where we're aiming to get to, and paganism is the way to get there. Because at the end of the day, paganism is not a political movement. Paganism was never started, it was never founded as a means to solving a societal global issue. I'm talking a lot here in this video about the environmental movement, obviously, because that is the issue that John has been talking about in his blog post as well. But I think you'll find that with all of this discussion, this will be very relevant for other political issues in general. I think across the board, the vast majority of pagans are left-leaning, and there are many different interrelated issues that pagans feel very strongly about, and the Black Lives Matter movement being one of them. I feel that very strongly that the vast majority, I feel, of the people that I see in this community are very pro Black Lives Matter and have been very vocal about being so. And I feel that recently, actually, when people are making videos and talking obliquely about politics and spirituality, and specifically politics and paganism or alternative spirituality or witchcraft, that they are implying this connection of Black Lives Matter to paganism, to alternative spirituality. And I just want to make it clear that in this video, I think it has been pretty clear from how I've been talking so far, I'm not speaking directly to that issue, but I do think that Black Lives Matter and various other movements and issues in society are going to be relevant to everything that I'm saying here today. But I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not speaking in code. I'm not actually referencing that specifically. I'm primarily answering back to this problem about the environmental crisis that John has been focusing on in his blog posts. Another big caveat that I really need to add to my vehement disagreement with the statement, that paganism has failed. Another big caveat is that while I think that it is misinformed or coming from an odd perspective to assume that paganism should be a political movement or should be moving towards political change, I absolutely agree that there are areas of paganism, alternative spirituality, of the broader community, that there are areas where you start to see, I feel like there's probably a spectrum from active political activism and social movements, direct movements towards social change, and that on the polar opposite of that is actions and beliefs and focuses that actually move us away from effecting social change, that overtly and actively tell us not to bother, that we don't have to do any of that work, that we don't need to worry about society, we don't need to worry about other people, we don't need to worry about politics or global issues. And this is what I mean by spiritual bypassing. So spiritual bypassing is a term that I have seen popping up in the community a lot in recent months, and primarily in relation to Black Lives Matter, I think, although a lot of the time when people are talking about it, they are speaking obliquely, like they are just talking about spiritual bypassing generally. And I think a lot of general issues have come about through people witnessing certain spiritual people's reactions to Black Lives Matter and so on. Apparently, I've just from a very brief little Google that I did on spiritual bypassing, and this used to be my understanding of it. It used to be more, it was coined back in the 80s, I think, and it used to be more associated with bypassing personal issues and mental health struggles and things like that through spiritual practices and so on. Whereas at the moment, I feel that it's primarily being used to reference bypassing societal issues and issues in our community, which is a a very different issue, but I think that both of them, both of those problems and both of those tendencies in certain forms of spirituality and religion are prevalent, and they do exist, and it's not something that I would ever condone. And this is actually a big part of why I think I want to argue that for the most part that perhaps we should actually separate our spirituality and our religion from our political and social activism, at least to some degree in our minds and in our actions and in our communities, because if we separate them, there's less of a tendency to not only feel as though you've already checked those boxes, as if you've already done the work that needs to be done in order to affect social, societal or global change, but also there is potentially less of a tendency to use spirituality as an excuse and to actually actively construct spiritual beliefs for yourself that actually tell you and others that no, you don't need to bother to do any of that work in the first place. Never mind that you've ticked the boxes. There are no boxes to tick because, you know, we're all one, or we're all going to transcend anyway, or whatever lingo it is that people are using to let themselves and other people off the hook, essentially, in terms of actually changing the very real problems that we are experiencing, and other people in particular maybe. I mean, speaking as a white Westerner, a lot of the problems that I'm talking about are very much other people's problems, and it would be probably quite easy for me to spiritually bypass by adopting a spiritual belief that told me that I just needed to focus on myself and everyone is going to transcend anyway, and we just need to focus on souls and everyone is all one, and essentially that all these worldly problems are not real, or that they're not real problems that actually need to be addressed. I think to some degree what John is talking about is a form of spiritual bypassing. I think some of what he's calling out in the community is spiritual bypassing, or at least the product of spiritual bypassing, and I've seen plenty of other environmentally focused pagans and so on making similar points, and it is a very good point and it's worth making. But I think there's a very big difference between calling out spiritual bypassing and suggesting that your spirituality or your religion, whether that's the practice that you have yourself or the community that you're involved with, that it should be the driving force towards that social change that needs to come about. So from my perspective, I just think that these two movements should be doing two different things. I don't think that paganism and environmentalism should be the same movement. I think they are doing two different things, and it pains me to see someone as intelligent and active in the community and spiritually interesting as John Halstead suggest that paganism's focus on the occult or on the gods is a distraction from what it should be doing. Because, you know, whoever said what paganism should or shouldn't be doing? I mean, this is one of the wondrous things about alternative spiritual practice. There's no dogma, there's no one rule book telling us what our religion or spirituality should be achieving. And in fact, even in traditional religions where we do have rule books or traditional sacred texts and authorities, we don't necessarily have to ascribe to that. Even we can draw our own conclusions to some degree as to what the point of religion or spirituality is. So I wouldn't want to see us moving towards a situation where people who use their spirituality, or maybe not use their spirituality because that sounds a bit, I was going to say use their spirituality to focus on themselves. That sounds a bit negative, and that's not how I mean it, but I guess what I mean is people who access their spirituality through focus on the self. I don't think that that should be denigrated. I think that there is power in that, and it's very important, and especially for, I think, women and LGBT plus people, and just all sorts of different people who have in any way struggled with their identity, struggled to find themselves in their society, struggled to find a place for themselves in their traditional religion. And many people are, and I mean, this is not just people like that as well. I mean, straight cis white men are also going through those problems and finding themselves as they come out of a repressive religion as well. And John Halstead was absolutely one of those people. Perhaps one of the reasons he's so now against that focus in paganism is because, I mean, on the self and on finding the self and so on, is because he sees it as a transitional period for him in his spiritual journey, but it doesn't have to be, and that's not how it is for everyone. It's not just a phase that everyone has to move through in order to achieve spiritual activism. I think it's a completely valid way to continue to explore your spirituality and to continue to explore the concept of divinity, whether that's in multiple deities or whether that's a pantheism, whatever your version of that looks like. I think that it's crucial for us to continue to nurture our own selves and to nurture our own psyches, and to not entirely denigrate that wonderful inner creative world that we can experience through these forms of spirituality. Instead, I would like to invite everyone, and myself included, to take more action outside of our spirituality, outside of our spiritual communities, outside of our religion, to take more action and get involved in movements and groups and organisations that actually are structured and developed in order to affect real global societal environmental change. Groups that have been organised by people with political experience, with experience of working with the powers that be, essentially, and that actually know better than your average pagan might know what actually needs to be changed in society in order to bring about the changes that we want to see. I don't think that the most effective way of doing that is by having a bunch of pagans who have not necessarily any background or experience in social activism trying to affect that. It makes much more sense to me to work with your experience and your knowledge and your expertise, essentially, in order to get the job done. So what I would want to see is more pagans sharing with one another, and there definitely has been a lot of this, especially with Black Lives Matter, and I think other movements as well over the years in recent times. There has been a tendency for our community to link to other movements, to link to organisations and important political stuff that is happening, and human rights stuff and environmental stuff that is happening in the world. But that is essentially what I would like to see more of, and to see more of an acknowledgement that no, maybe paganism can't save the world, and maybe it hasn't failed if it hasn't managed to do that, because at the end of the day, even when paganism is a communal activity, even when we are meeting in groups and in covens, and when we are engaging in group practice and in group worship, I don't think that just because we're engaging in a group, with a group, or in a community, that necessarily means that the goal of that and the outcome of that should be some concrete change in the world, because I just don't think that that's the most effective way to bring it about. So yeah, I guess my conclusion is just to let spirituality be spirituality, let religion be religion. I mean, I could make a whole series of video essays about that whole can of worms of what religion really is, or what spirituality really is, but my point really is that I don't ever want to see it being reduced to a political movement just because we are operating in a sphere of alternative spirituality. Just because the word alternative is in the title doesn't mean that we should ever reduce it, reduce our spiritual experiences and reduce our spiritual goals to specific societal or political changes that we're trying to bring about. I do think, and I've said this again and again, and I know I said this recently in my Pantheism, what does Pantheism look like in 2021 video, I do say over and over again that of course certain spiritual perspectives and beliefs are going to be more likely to nurture a worldview that will actually help to bolster and provide that groundswell to these political movements that are actually going to bring about the practical, pragmatic change that we need. I do think that there's value in that, and it's one of the very important ways that people have become more aware of their surroundings and more aware of the world and the people in that world. And I think a lot of people have become more politically engaged through their alternative spiritual practice. But I just think it's important to distinguish between the two, and to point out that they're not necessarily the same thing. And rather than saying that paganism has failed, maybe it's more accurate to say that so far with the environment we have failed. we as a society, as a globe, we have not done enough yet. And we're starting to talk about it more, or we have been for a few years, but we're still not there. We're still not doing enough. And I don't think that that's necessarily a failure on one specific group, because they are related spiritually to the earth, to natural things, and to an alternative perspective. I don't think that we can necessarily be expecting so much of a group that was never overtly trying to bring about a halt to global warming. I'm going to stop there because I probably could ramble for a very long time about this, and I'm already going to have to spend a lot of time editing this down. But I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this. I'd love to get a debate going on down in the comments. If you agree, if you disagree, what are your thoughts on spiritual bypassing in particular? That's a topic that has been coming up a lot in the community recently. And yeah, just let me know your thoughts. Let me know your reactions if you agree or disagree. I'm always happy to hear. So yeah, thanks as usual for watching. I will be talking to you again soon, and I hope you're all safe and well and having a pleasant summer. And yeah, thanks for watching.